Hi, everybody. Oops. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give a moment to see if anybody else needs to be added to the group. It's up to you guys if you want to have your videos on or off. Myself and Dr. Berg will have ours on. And if you could just mute yourselves so that we don't have any background noise, that would be great. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'll let anybody else in as they come. We have Dr. Ann Berg. We're really excited to have her here. She's from Lurie Children's Hospital, and she is the research professor of pediatrics for neurology and epilepsy for Northwestern University, Feinberg, and School of Medicine. And I am Jenny Gallo from the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. So welcome, everybody. If once Dr. Berg starts, like I had mentioned, if you could just keep yourself on mute so that we don't have any interruptions. And then any questions, if you can hold till the end, that would be great. And there is a chat. If you hover at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat window, and you can actually, you can type it in there at any time, and I'll read that to her at the end, or at the end, as long as there's not too many people all at once, we can, just unmute ourselves and talk that way as well. So go ahead. I give you Miss Dr. Berg.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jenny. Is the audio okay? Can everyone hear?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to thank all of you and thank the Dravet Syndrome Foundation for inviting me to talk with you today, because what I'm going to be talking with you about are several projects that we've been working on together, and it's really been an amazing journey to work with you. I'm going to start with something that's motivated this journey, both for Dravet syndrome and for other organizations as well, for pretty much all rare diseases. And that is the fact that we're now focusing on rare diseases. Pharmaceutical industry is focusing on rare diseases as part of the precision medicine push. And the FDA has realized and advised people that if they wish to study rare diseases, they really need to understand the full range of disease manifestations before they jump in and start treating a disorder they don't understand well. This is something that is not that the FDA didn't come up with itself. This largely comes from the patient communities and the advocate voices. And the Dravet syndrome group has been one of the more vocal and one of the earlier groups to do this. And you've really mentored many other groups in the rare epilepsy space in doing this. A few years ago, Nicole Villas, Marianne Meskis, and Sue Goodliff published this survey that many of you, perhaps all of you, took part in, looking at the other correlates associated with Dravet syndrome, in addition to the seizures. Just a minute, there we go. And they demonstrated, and you demonstrated, that in addition to seizures, there are a host of other concerns having to do with behavior, communication, the effects on the family, gait, sleep issues, a lot of medical and dysautonomic issues as well, along with appetite and GI problems. This led into a PCORI-funded project that your organization has been involved in. There are a couple different pieces of it, but the days of Dravet programs that have been held around the country, this has been part of that conversation. A couple of years ago, I and several colleagues began to partner with the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, as well as the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation, KCNQ2 Cure Alliance, the KCMB families, and some other groups to start the process of developing a natural history platform to help provide natural history information for young people with Dravet syndrome and other forms of epilepsy. And many of you have visited this platform. I want to have a shout out for my colleague, Gary Nesbitt in Dublin, Ireland, who created the software that allows us to do this kind of research of a rare disease across the entire country and really across the world. How is this program that we're doing different from other ones you might have participated in? First of all, we, the investigators, didn't just come up with a bunch of questionnaires and ask you to fill them out, but rather we went to you, and we involved myself, several neurologists, psychiatrists, other content experts, and we asked you, what is important? What do you need to know about what your child has? And this is intended to be more than a checklist. And what we're trying to do is not just identify the areas, although your group has already done that, but to understand more their nature. What kind of impairments are there? How often do they happen? How severe are they? And how much do they vary over time? And then very important in this study, we want to report the results back to family groups, not just hold on to them for ourselves. And this involves providing information that goes back onto your website, as well as webinars like this today, but also dissemination of information to the scientific and provider communities through meeting reports as well as publications. If you're interested, you can go to the website, you can access it here, and you'll have these slides later. And you can see the results that we've produced both for Dravet syndrome and some of the other groups as well.
Dr. Berg,
Yep.
I'm sorry. Are you sharing your screen?
Yes, I'm not?
No.
Okay, let's try that again.
Sorry.
Oh, I wish you'd stopped me earlier. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let's try that again.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you were, and then I was like, no, you wanted access, so.
All right. Here we go. That looks like a share screen button. I am so sorry. I wish.
No, that's okay. I mean, hopefully it was okay for everybody else, but I was able to follow what you were saying.
Do you see anything?
Yes, now we do.
Okay.
Or at least I do.
Does everybody? I'm just going to go back here real quickly. This is the website that I mentioned that we have, that you've all helped with, how we're trying to be a little bit different, and be sure to allow, sorry, got to fix this here. If you're interested in our results, you can go to our website and click the results icon, and you can see what we've produced both for Dravet syndrome as well as other epilepsy groups that we've been working with. So with the Dravet syndrome community, we've done a few things. We have our initial natural history study. I'm going to talk about that primarily today. We also have the ability study, which we just did in February, and then the Gait study, which is coming up. And I really want to emphasize, without you, without your incredible support and your incredible participation, none of this would have been possible. You're an amazing organization. So for the first natural history project, which was not meant to be a study as in a longitudinal study, but just simply, where are we? What does the forest look like? What are the trees? We had 103 families participate, which is outstanding. They came from mostly North America, mostly the US, but we have some in the UK, Spain, and Australia. We have roughly half and half boys and girls, male, female, a little bit more female than male. And this is really interesting. A lot of your children are fairly young, 0 to 4. And this is important because in the past, Dravet syndrome was not recognized until years and years into the disorder, but that means you're getting the diagnosis much more quickly than happened in the past. But we also have young adults in here. Most of you, 89%, said your child had a pathogenic SCN1A variant. Some had a variant, you weren't sure if it was pathogenic, and some said no variant. And that's okay, because Dravet syndrome is not a disease, it is a syndrome, and you can have it through other ways. I'm going to talk a bit about the seizures, because as Jenny and I were talking just before we started, those are so overwhelming when they occur, as you know. And I don't think anything I'm going to be telling you right now is going to be a surprise. You probably already know it, but I think it's worth reviewing. The age at first seizure, median is 5 months, half below 5 and the other half 5 and above. The oldest reported onset was at 18 months. Your children have a lot of different seizures, you know that. Lots of convulsions, lots of hemiconvulsions, absence, myoclonic, and then a host of other seizure types as well. All children have multiple different seizure types. Seizure frequency is rough. Just about a quarter of you said in the past week your children had had seizures every single day. Now, I just want to mention, I said in the past week, we did not endeavor to do an entire exhaustive history. This is just a snapshot of what's going on at any one point in time. So everyday seizures or most day seizures. On the other hand, 38% of you said your children had not had seizures in the past week. So there are gaps in seizure frequency. If we look at a group like Lennox-Gastaut, that's not so much the case. When your children had seizures, some of them only had 1 or 2 a day, almost half of them, but many had multiple seizures, with a good chunk having 10 or more seizures a day. And some of you said, I really can't tell you, it's all across the board. As you know, your children tend to have triggers for their seizures. 89% of you identified some kind of trigger for your child's seizures. It was almost always illness, with fever, with or without fever, or temperature change due to ambient temperature or even taking a bath. But in addition to that, 60% identified emotional excitement, both positive and negative, as well as somewhat fewer visual stimulation as factors that could set your child off on a seizure. About half of you said that your children's seizures were moderately to extremely unpredictable. You just didn't know when they were going to happen. 95% of you, almost everyone, said that your child had had a prolonged seizure, 10 minutes or longer, at least at some point in their history. In the previous 6 months, the period that we asked in this questionnaire, almost half of you said your child had had a prolonged seizure. There were a lot with convulsive seizures, as well as non-convulsive and myoclonic, but those convulsive seizures, most, if you'd had a convulsive seizure, had more than one. Almost a third of you went to the ED at least once in the past 6 months. 18% of you, almost 1 out of 5, was in the ED multiple times, which I find astounding. In the past 6 months, 70% of you had used rescue medications for your child, and that broke down to about half of you who'd used them 1 to 9 times, and 22% who'd used them 10 or more times. Very importantly, and this was a question that you, the parents, asked us to ask, so we did. When you used rescue medications, did you need a second dose? And 15% of you said, yeah, half the time I needed a second dose. 15% of the time said, most of the time I needed a second dose. And 10% said, I always needed a second dose. The most common rescue meds that are being used currently are Klonopin, Diastat, and Versed. In addition to rescue meds, half of you used bridging medications at least once. That is, not to stop a seizure, but at times when you felt your child was particularly vulnerable for seizures, for example, during an illness. Many of you used them 1 to 4 times, but 19% of you had to use bridging medicines more than 5 times. Currently, 69% of you said you have a seizure rescue plan. And that's not bad. I'd love to see it be 100%, because when we looked at who didn't have a seizure rescue plan, we found that 38% of you who said your child had a prolonged seizure, 33% of those who went to the emergency department, 32% of those who had to use rescue meds, and 23% of those who used bridge meds said they did not have a seizure rescue plan. I want to take a moment to call out this website down here, Deep Connections. This is a new project that's being started by some parents, and they're holding a series of webinars in the next couple of weeks, I believe starting June 11th, and they're specific to what a rescue plan is and how to develop one. So if you don't have a rescue plan, you might want to check this out. Dr. Elaine Wirral will be giving the kickoff to that webinar series, and I know she's a great friend of Dravet syndrome, and I know you'd love to hear her. Excuse me. Beyond seizures, because there is far more beyond seizures, there is a lot of impairment. If we look at basic functional impairment, 8% of your children require a mobility device at home or in the school for short distances. Only 3% said that their children could not use their hands to grasp objects, but that's still some. Along with that, a quarter do not feed themselves or need substantial assistance, and that includes 12% of the group with G-tubes. 21% do not use spoken language, and overall, 40% of you said that your children inconsistently or rarely communicate even with people that they know well. You, for example. That sort of focuses on what children can't do, but what can children with Dravet syndrome do? For feeding, those who can use their hands, and these are questions for children 2 and older, most can use a spoon or fork to feed themselves, and 65% can drink from an open cup. In terms of self-care, about 22% can brush their teeth, 31% are completely independent for toileting use purposes, almost half can wash and dry their hands, and 20% can dress themselves. Now, I do want to emphasize, when I say independent, I mean physically independent. Many of you indicated that you still had to give your children some verbal reminders or prompts to do these tasks. Most of your children use a touchscreen device. Those things are magic. And about half have some simple academic skills, and that includes knowing letters, being able to write names, recognizing simple words, or maybe reading a simple sentence. And many of your children like to scribble or draw with a crayon or pencil. In terms of the kinds of activities your children enjoy, playing in water is a big one. Who doesn't like playing in water? Coloring, singing songs, listening to music, and being sung to were big hits for everyone, and also being read to. Doing puzzles, very interestingly, is another favorite pastime and a real strength of children with Dravet syndrome. And I mention this because this is a complicated task. It takes a lot of complex visual processing and then good hand use and hand-eye coordination. And we don't see these abilities come together in some of the other groups. So this may be a special strength in children with Dravet syndrome. Behavior is a very important issue for parents of children with Dravet syndrome, and we saw a lot of children with diagnoses of autism, or at least features of autism, more than half. Some of your children have been diagnosed with anxiety, or you have identified features of anxiety, and this is really important. We don't think a lot about mood disorders in people with intellectual disabilities, but they sure can have them. So be aware of these sorts of issues. They may not, if you think your child has anxiety or depression, don't write it off. Be sure to talk to your provider about that. ADHD was also a fairly common diagnosis, and many children have features of ADHD. And many of you also indicated that your child had either been diagnosed with either some kind of aggression disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. In terms of specific disruptive behaviors, we see a lot of frequent frustrations, not as much verbal aggression, but more physical aggression, disobedience, temper tantrums, and a lot of repetitive behaviors, which of course goes along with the autism. Something else that's very important in children with Dravet syndrome are safety concerns. A good number of your children, you had concerns about stranger danger or not having stranger danger, and your children will approach strangers, sometimes inappropriately. And self-injury can be a bit of an issue as well. On the other hand, very positive side, most of you described your children as happy and sweet. You said they showed concerns for others, and that's really important. That empathy is a very complex emotion and skill, so you should be proud of that. And many of you said that your children get along well with adults. You have a lot of people taking care of your children. A lot, over half see a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, almost half see a physical therapist, and then a variety of different behavioral therapists were identified as well. You also have a lot of medical specialists involved, of course, a neurologist, but we see special needs dentists, orthopedists, dietitians, cardiologists, gastroenterologists, and so on and so forth. When you put it all together, your children see a median of 5 different therapists and medical specialists at any one time. 60% of you said your children have 2 or more therapy appointments a week. That means that in addition to everything else you're doing, you're taking them to at least 2 appointments a week. And 20% of you felt that your care was poorly coordinated across specialists. Now, that 20% actually didn't seem too bad to me. I've seen far worse for some of the other groups, but I sort of wondered which 20% didn't feel their care was well coordinated. And it would seem that if you have more therapists, a lot of therapy appointments, if you live far away from your provider, that would lead to poorer coordination of care. But in fact, that didn't seem to be what was going on. What we found was that age was a driving factor. In children, very young children, 0 to 4, parents by and large were pretty satisfied with care. The worst was feeling indifferent. But as they got older, we see this darker blue come in, and those are the people who said the care was just fractured. And by the time we get to the 16-year and older, we see going on 50% being either indifferent to saying their care was fractured. I think this reflects 2 things. Probably as children enter school, there's some issues with coordinating between what's going on in the school and what's going on at home. The school becomes part of the care team. And then as children are 16 and older, we start to think about transition. And I'm concerned that some of this may reflect adult children who have moved on to a very different system than pediatric care. 85% of you have other children. And 73% of those, nearly 3/4, said that having a child with Dravet syndrome limited the amount of attention that you could provide to your other children. Over half of you said your other children had to grow up too fast or faster than you would have liked. Interestingly, we asked whether your children resented their sibling with Dravet syndrome, and some certainly did, but 43% of you said not at all. And that was really kind of nice to see. It's hard for other siblings, and to see that so many of them did not resent their other sibling with Dravet syndrome is really great. These are some of the comments that you shared with us about the effect of having a child with Dravet syndrome on your other children. And there are a couple of themes that came out. One was the career choices that your other children made, going into neurological research or wanting to go into a nursing program because of having a child at home, a sibling at home with Dravet syndrome. There was a lot about the compassion that your other children learned. They are awesome siblings and so compassionate and loving because of loving their sister so much, and how their brother taught them unconditional love and compassion for others. We also saw comments like, we were afraid to have another child for fear of having one with Dravet syndrome. Very important, and something that a genetic counselor can really help with. And then just the general idea that having someone who is as ill as a child with Dravet syndrome just affects everything, even just being in the car. I also want to remind, or just to give a shout out to Lurie Bailey, who's done a lot of work on the impact of siblings with Dravet syndrome. And this is really echoing much of the work that she has done. With all of that, you're probably not surprised that having a child with Dravet syndrome has a huge impact on you. 83% of you said that life feels like a roller coaster, and 70% of you report moderate to severe fatigue. So with this natural history study, we've started to define the landscape of what Dravet syndrome is. We always say it's a form of epilepsy that involves moderate to severe disability, but what does that look like? What are the impairments and how severe are they? And what can children do? One of the things we did both at the beginning and then after the initial study was to identify some big priorities for Dravet syndrome. One was sleep, and we actually looked at that in the initial natural history project, and I'll give you those results in just a moment. And then also the Gait study, and I'll tell you about that afterwards. As you know, in Nicole's paper, 85% of you said that sleep was a big problem. So as part of the original Natural History Project, we asked you, parents, to review and critique some of the common sleep instruments that are out there for measuring sleep quality in children. And there's a list of them, and you read them. You didn't take them, you read them, and you critiqued them. And then you told us how not to ask a parent about sleep. The questionnaires did not ask about nocturnal seizures. They considered co-sleeping or falling asleep in a parent's bed as a negative, as a sign of a sleep disturbance. They asked about children having sleepovers. That wasn't going to happen with your children. Enuresis is considered part of a sleep disorder, but in fact, a lot of children, even adult children with Dravet syndrome, are not toilet trained, and if they are during the day, they're not at night. So that was not a very helpful question. A lot of the questionnaires asked about, is this a big problem or a little problem? And as one parent very eloquently said, stop asking us if something's a problem, it's all a problem. And you really helped us to start framing questions in terms of how often does this happen? And then of course the standard questionnaires didn't ask about the influence of seizure medications on sleepiness and wakefulness. We went ahead and asked a series of questions. Some came from the general sleep hygiene questionnaires. Does your child go to bed at the same time? Most of you said yes, and a few of you said most of the time, or about half the time, he makes his bedtime, and then some said no, too variable. But there are lots of reasons for that. The time to fall asleep didn't seem particularly unusual. Some took a really long time, but most were falling asleep within a half hour. And then the amount of sleep per night, there are some getting maybe on the low side, some a bit on the high side, but not greatly different from what we would expect. But there are the nocturnal disturbances. In terms of seizures, half of you said your child had not recently had nocturnal seizures, which is great, but a full quarter of you said that your children had nocturnal seizures at least 3 nights a week. So about half the nights every week, your child would have nocturnal seizures, some at least weekly, but not that often, and a few would only have occasional sporadic ones. In addition to nocturnal seizures, your children wake up a lot at night. 17% don't wake up, but look at this, a full quarter wake up pretty much every single night, and another 16% wake up 3 to 5 nights a week. Some only a couple times a week and some less often, but this is a lot of sleep disturbance. Because of the seizures, because of the waking up, because of other reasons, almost all of you monitor your child's sleep. And the most common way to do that is co-sleeping. Again, we go back to co-sleeping being a sign of sleep pathology or something you do to protect your child. There's a lot of video monitoring, movement monitors, audio monitors, and so forth. And that was interesting. There we go. And some of you have sleep service dogs. It is a lot of work though. And you know, I mentioned 70% of you report moderate to severe fatigue. Just to mention a little bit further, 2/3 of you said your children have some kind of unusual breathing pattern, a lot of snoring, mouth breathing, teeth grinding, and apnea. This is not at all unusual. About 1/3 of your children had had a sleep diagnosis, sometimes multiple, but these included apnea, insomnia, and night terrors is the most common. 32% of you used some kind of sleep medication. Melatonin was the hands down winner. Almost all the parents who said they used a sleep medication mentioned melatonin. And then daily seizure medications, those have a huge impact. They increase drowsiness during the day, increase restlessness, and 14% of you said you felt that your child's seizure medications caused trouble either falling asleep or staying asleep. In addition, remember how many of you were using rescue medications? Those increase drowsiness too. It's all connected. So based on that, we are starting to get an idea of how we can talk about sleep disturbances in children with Dravet syndrome. And I think this will also be helpful for other families who have children with other forms of developmental epilepsies and encephalopathies. So thank you for that. That paper, by the way, sorry to flip back and forth, this paper is currently in review, and I'm very hopeful we will have it out and available to everyone by the end of the year. The other issue that is extremely important that you identified as a really critical area of concern is gait. 75% of you on the questionnaire that Nicole and her colleagues did identify gait disturbance as a real concern. Now, as you know, children with Dravet syndrome tend to have pretty typical gait to begin with. They do tend to be a little bit delayed in walking. That could be effect of seizures and medications, but when they do walk, they tend to walk pretty well. But then as they approach or enter adolescence, they develop this characteristic gait deterioration that's been called the crouched gait. And this can culminate in significant mobility limitations and even the need for a wheelchair. And what I've been told is that this crouch gait, this cartoon here, is actually what led Dr. Charlotte Dravet to recognize children in the Lennox-Gastaut setting who were later identified to have Dravet syndrome. It's a real characteristic feature of Dravet syndrome. So that leads us to the ability study. 10 days in February, this past February, 135 parents participated, many from the Dravet syndrome community. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank our parents from Lennox-Gastaut, KCNQ2 Cure Alliance, KCMB1 families, and SCN2A families. Again, my colleagues from the Ability Lab, Drs. Deb Gabler and Tassos Karakostas, have been just incredibly helpful and supportive in helping us devise the study so that we're looking at what children can do and not what they can't do. And there's a real distinction there. Now, why this is important is, remember this FDA guidance, you have to understand the full range of disease manifestations. They also said you have to select your clinical endpoint. So we've talked about sleep and now gait. And the other piece of that is that you have to have sensitive and specific outcome measures. And this is if you wanted to do a study to see if a therapy could actually improve gait or stop the deterioration. You need to understand how it happens and be able to measure it. So we, in the ability study, asked you to fill out a large number of questionnaires. I know it was a lot, and thank you for the patience in doing it. The first one I'm going to tell you about was the functional mobility scale. And this is done at 5, 50, and 500 meters. And we asked you whether your child needed a wheelchair, walked but needed assistance, was independent, at least on level ground, and might need assistance going upstairs or on less level ground, and then independent on all terrains. And what you can see is that in the home, as I've already mentioned, only about 10% needed a wheelchair. When you get into somewhat longer distances, a slight bit more. And when you get on it into the community, it was close to 40% needed a wheelchair. But that's not because they can't walk. And again, talking to parents helped us so much understand this. And they said, you need to ask us why we're using a wheelchair. And the reasons were really enlightening. And they could be, what I'm going to tell you, parents could answer many of these, but only 4 parents whose children went from not being in a wheelchair here to being in a wheelchair here said that their child couldn't walk the distance. A lot of times the change was made for behavior management, safety, to avoid seizures, to avoid a seizure from overexertion or overheating, and sometimes just for convenience. So there are reasons that you decide that your child is not going to walk, which is not the same thing as your child not being able to walk. We used another measure called the FAQ, the Functional Activities Questionnaire, which is a single question, and you're asked to rate your child on a scale from 1 to 8 in this case. And the scale goes from, my child cannot take any steps, to my child walks, runs, and climbs on anything. And you can see that younger children tend to score in the lower range, which is what we would expect. But once we get above 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds and older, are basically functioning about the same. And we're seeing a variety of answers of levels of ability, which is exactly what we need if we wish to study gait in the setting. We also asked you a series of questionnaires. And again, you were very patient. I'm sure you thought, I've already answered these questions. Why is she asking me again? But we were actually asking you different questionnaires geared at an infant toddler level, at a young child level, and at an older child level to see how well children could perform mobility activities. And you can see at the infant toddler level, most of your children are pretty high. Not everyone though. By the time they're 3, everyone should be up here, and they're not, so there is still variation. We see good spread for here, and for the older type skills, we're seeing that people are falling off. What we're in the process of doing right now is combining these into a single measure so that we can measure gait in Dravet syndrome in a way that is relevant to what your children can do now, and we'll be able to see if they improve or if they start to have difficulties. For the ability study, you also helped us figure out if we were asking the right questions overall. And overall, for developmental skills, behavior, communication, you said, yeah, these are at the right level. A few said too easy, a few too hard, but most of you felt that we were asking the right kinds of questions, and that's not the feedback that we've gotten from other studies. So I was very pleased about that. Most of you felt that the questions were easy to understand or mostly easy. A few thought hard. We're going to go back and talk to some parents who said that. And then, did we give you the right choices to answer the questions? And most of you said, yes, they were adequate or mostly adequate. And a few said not so much really. And again, we're going to go back and see if we can do a better job with that. But overall, with your help, and this comes from the original natural history study into the ability study and the feedback you're giving us, we're now starting to understand how to ask questions that are relevant to your children and that you can answer in a way that is relevant to your experiences. The third part of this FDA guidance was to conduct a study of sufficient duration to capture clinically meaningful outcomes and variability in the course of the disease. And that is for the future, but I hope it's the near future, with Marianne Meskis, Nicole Villas, and several people, including my colleagues from the Ability Lab, Dr. Gabler and Dr. Kara Kostas. We have designed a prospective longitudinal study that will look at gait mechanics, how that affects gait function, and how that affects how your child behaves and what he or she is able to do in terms of mobility in his or her everyday life. This is for the future. We're in the process of trying to obtain funding, and I hope very soon we'll be able to send out an announcement and invite you to take part in that as well. With that, I want to thank everyone. You have just been amazing. Thank all of the parents who've participated in any of these studies and given us feedback. And if you have questions, I would be most happy to answer those for you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Berg. There was one question in the chat about the slides, but I answered that. So if anybody has any questions, if you want to pop it into our chat.
Yes, I will have the slides. I just saw, hi Sally, yes, I will definitely have the slides for you.
Okay, so what are your next steps and what can we do to help?
Our next step, so we have the Gait study pretty well designed, and Marianne has just been astounding, helping make connections with several of the pharmaceutical companies that have been developing therapies for Dravet syndrome. You know who those are, the CBD, the fenfluramine, and others that are coming out, stiripentol as well. And we are working with those companies to find a way in partnership to fund this study. And when it's ready, we will be coming to you. if you know anyone and want to encourage them about the importance of the study, that would be very helpful too.
Okay, great. That was Nicole's question too, Dr. Okay, Christine says, with the service seizure dogs related to sleeping, was there any indication that the service / seizure dog prevented any of the sleep disturbances?
Oh, that is a really good question, and we did not ask. But we could certainly try to include that in another round of questions.
And Sally says, will the Gait studies be in person or a questionnaire?
Both. We will be doing it in conjunction with children's neurologists to get neurological exams and some gait, actual functional gait measures, and then also online. So it'll be a hybrid of the two.
There are similar studies done in other countries like in UK and China. Is there any plan to combine the results on the global level?
I have not spoken with those investigators, but that's something obviously all rare disease organizations would really like to do instead of having a bunch of small studies going on here and there, bring everyone together and have a warehouse for those studies. But at this point, I have not done that. I will say that part of what we are really trying to do is address some FDA requirements that they have for reasonable measures in a trial. So we are doing that very specifically with their requirements in mind, and I don't know if the other studies have done the same.
Many people say they love you. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are wonderful.
Your Mandy's heading your fan club here.
Thanks, Mandy.
Thank you for your studies and for your wonderful presentation. This was very informative and helpful. I look forward to the other studies. Somebody that. Are there any other questions that we can help anybody with? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then, you know, I'd like to, how many families do you expect to enroll?
We are hoping to enroll about 100 for the Gait study. Yeah. And again, we're, I keep reminding everyone, this isn't to do a nice little study. We're really trying to get these instruments so that when it comes time to do a trial, we can give you definitive answers.
And you'll be including adults in that as
well? That has to be determined, and that's in part, yes, we will. Let's put adults, yes.
Okay. I'm curious why, oh, hold on one second. They're all coming in now. Hold on, my screen's going up. I'm curious why these studies are small numbers.
If by 103, is that, for me, that's a really amazing number. Dravet syndrome is extremely rare. And the parents are, I am just overwhelmed by what you do every day, and the fact that you can take some time to do a study is pretty remarkable. So I'm grateful for every parent, and I think 100 parents with Dravet syndrome who take the time to participate, just amazing, just astounding.
Now that we know that disturbance is significant in Dravet and parents are employing several different monitors, what do you think is the best way to design a suit-up study?
I guess the question is, what is the question in the suit-up study? And I'm not sure if the monitors being used would necessarily be the ones that could help alert a parent to suit up. I think the seizure, knowing that your child is having a seizure is probably the best best alert, and without knowing why some parents prefer co-sleeping versus video versus auditory or movement monitors. I think we need to learn a bit more about that before I could answer that question. It's a great question though.
Nicole was asking the community, since numbers needed provide significance and you understand the parent perspective regarding sleep. So that's why she was asking that.
Okay.
I'm very interested in hearing from the Gait study how much the therapies can influence gait problem. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. I just want to remind everybody that Monday, June 1st at 12 o'clock, we have a coffee chat, and, sign up for that if you're interested. And on Thursday, June 4th, we have Scott Baraban, discovery and development of new therapies using zebrafish at 3 o'clock, same time. I think that's it. Those are all the questions. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Berg. Thank you so much for all of your help with the Dravet syndrome and your study.
Well, thank you all. It's really been a privilege and such a pleasure, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future.
Great.
Stay safe. Jenny, I'm just going to head off. I'll see you later.
Okay, great.
Okay. Bye-bye.